philosophy better. But when I went to applied to grad school, I found out that the philosophy I was taught as an undergraduate was continental. I was just taught philosophy. They never said, we're teaching you continental philosophy. And so when I applied to philosophy grad programs, I got nowhere because I didn't understand that there was this thing called analytical that was so dominant. And of course, I was such an idiot, I didn't bother to actually ask my professors any of this. So anyway, I go to grad school, and I thought I'm going to study literature, like many of us do. And I thought I was going to study Romanticism. So I'm a brand new master's student, and I'm taking this class in Romanticism. It was Blake and Shelley. Now, Blake's a genius. In fact, he's such a genius, I don't even consider him a romantic poet. I think that's a disservice to the man. But then we hit Shelley. And oh my God, I hate Shelley. I loathe Shelley. I was reading this stuff and I was going, why am I in grad school? There's this one line in one of his poems where he's going, I weep, I bleed. And I'm like, I hate you. And that was the beginning of my rediscovery of theory, because there was a woman named Luann Frank who taught the heavy theory courses. And next semester, she was teaching a course in Heidegger. And I took it. And suddenly this whole new realm opened up for me, that you could do philosophy in literature or English departments. And, you know, I haven't been the same since. Although, I should add, I didn't like Heidegger the first time I read him. All that authenticity and death stuff.
In fact, that's what we spent a lot of time talking about.
Who can take it?
Yeah, I mean, I was just, because they didn't read the section on being towards death. We just did the introduction. So I forecast a little bit. I mean, you don't have a whole lot of the language of authenticity in the introduction that we read, but obviously, you know, once we start into the book proper, the authentic and inauthentic relation is important, and then, you know, subsequently the being towards death as the signature element of the authentic relation of that side. So
yeah. So anyway, I did the Heidegger, and I was fascinated because, you know, it's theory, but Heidegger never grabbed me back then. I was much more into Zizek, and Foucault were the ones that I really liked. But then something happened around the time I got to Purdue. I decided to read The Principle of Reason, which is still my favorite lecture that he has in book form. It doesn't have the most promising title, I grant, The Principle of Reason. But I liked the later Heidegger better, and the later Heidegger was my road back into Heidegger. So,
what do you think? I mean, how would you distinguish? We talked. I gave him a little bit of a prior indication, but how would you distinguish between what gets called late Heidegger and early Heidegger?
Well, people like to describe it as a turn. I don't know if that's accurate or not. The Heideggerians can debate that. Well, I really like Heidegger, and I learned a lot from Heidegger. I don't consider myself a Heideggerian for many reasons. But what I do like about the later Heidegger is that, for one thing, he starts trying to jettison a lot of the standard philosophical terminology and develop a new style of philosophizing. And in this way, I think he learned a lot from Nietzsche. And I like that aspect of Heidegger, that he's wrestling with language itself, and that he understands that style has and this ought to appeal to you, John, has greater ontological depth than it appears to on first blush. As you all know, rhetoric often gets castigated for being ornamental. But of course, we all know that's actually a very shallow critique from people who haven't actually thought it through or read their Nietzsche.
That's right.
So one thing I like is the language, and the attempt to speak in more everyday language, Although then, and I also like this, he kind of tortures that everyday language. All that stuff about the thinging, and ringing out world. Is it things? Yeah. I actually really like that. I can understand how it drives other people nuts. But I understand what he's trying to do with the language. He's trying to make it do things and say things that our customary idioms resist. And so he's trying to make it generate insights about, say, overcoming the subject-object relationship or representationalism that is oftentimes built into language. That insight isn't new with Heidegger, by the way. I mean, Nietzsche had a field day with some of that stuff. So that's two things off the bat. I could go further, but I think that's good.
So what do you feel? Let's return to that question, to the issue of authenticity, because I mean, I kind of ranted about it a bunch, but it obviously is a touchstone issue for lots of folks who traffic in Heidegger. And I was wondering if, just to get your take on why, like, what's the problem with authenticity? I mean, why, we, in our conversation, we just sort of just presume that it is because we just know that it is. But why isn't it a problem? Or why did you have, when you first encountered Heidegger and you were read that stuff in Being in Time and you bristled about it, what was the source of the bristling?
When I first read it, I'll be the first to admit my understanding of what he meant by authenticity was shallow. I'll admit that. But I still think there is something a bit, what's the word, rigid in the concept, that the idea that there's something that's ownmost. It seemed to me at the time very limiting. As I've wrestled with the concept more over the years, I have a deeper understanding of what he's trying to do. I still don't, love it, but at least I now have an appreciation of what he was trying to wrestle with. And we might put it this way. Authenticity isn't saying that there's like one path or a destiny that something has to follow. It's suggesting, however, that there's a singularity to things and to people and to beings. Some singularity that unfolds in its own particular way. And I recognize that there's something to that. And I also recognize that he's trying to build that into some sort of ethic. And the ethic would run something like this. That a being that's other than you has something singular about it in however it unfolds and makes its way through life. And that we have to have a respect for, or a nearness to, or a response to, that allows that thing to be on its own terms in some fashion. So it's a declination to impose. So I recognize that too, and I recognize that that's got something to it. I mean, without that insight, where's Levinas, right? Although Levinas maybe does better things with that. That's a conversation maybe we can have. But I'm not a Levinasian, so we'll take it from there. But still, I recognize that authenticity is pulled into that ethic. And in that sense, I can appreciate what he's trying to do. I don't know that he actually gets there. I think authenticity has a ring to it, a resonance that perhaps works against whatever it is he's trying to do. Maybe that's the way to put it.
Okay. How do you feel like, and we'll start to transition in a little bit into talking about the thing, but before that, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about your ambient project is it's a conjunction, it's a fourfourfold. Sorry, I just had to do that. It's a this little Heidegger comedy right there. So it's a conjunction of the sort of musicology stuff, the techie. I don't even know what any of this thing. Just the technology-oriented stuff, and the new materialism, but also Heidegger in there. And that's a kind of, in some ways, it's recognizable and it's understandable to me why Heidegger would be one of the figures in that quadrant. But it's also a little weird too, right? It's a little weird insofar as like, here's one thing that Heidegger rarely has anything nice to say about: technology.
Okay. Again, I think that's a common understanding, but I actually don't think it's accurate. Okay. Even in the essay we read today,
yeah,
he makes a interesting statement near the end in a letter to a young student, where he talks about what he says. Oh no, pardon me. It's right at the end of the thing. He says, "Nor do things as things ever come about." This is page 182 at the top. "Nor do things as things ever come about if we merely avoid objects and recollect former objects, which perhaps were once on the way to becoming things and even to actually presencing as things." What he's saying is there's no nostalgia, and he understands that. And in essays like the essay on Gelassenheit and in other places, he'll say over and over again, there's no going back. There's no simple saying no to technology. What he wants to do is come to the right relation to technology. He wants to find a new way forward with technology that works with technology, but doesn't let technology squeeze out other ways of the world's coming to presence that he understands to have value, great value.
Well, but let's talk about that in the context of the thing, for instance. So, like, the impetus behind the essay, or at least how it starts off, right, is this sense in which nearness, well, distance has been obliterated.
Distance is obliterating nearness.
right. So distance is obliterated, and what's doing that obliterating is technology, right? Like television, radio. I mean, what we would loosely call, I mean, you know, and this is, what, 60 years ago? I mean, so the distance is obliterated, but that has done nothing to bring things nearer to us. Because for him in some way, I mean, because of, I guess this is what he's after, because of the uniformity of non-distance, all things are equally distant, that the issue of nearness is elided at some level. Is that fair?
Yeah, or it's compressed, like a bad audio CD that's a victim of the loudness wars. You know.
Yeah. So I mean, but that's the way in which, okay. And I think that to me, it's not so different in the technology essay. Is that there is this sense in which technology doesn't offer. Technology seems to be the thing that offers the problem that we've got to deal with, which is to say, technology isn't the thing that seems to offer the answer, ever, right? Or even a conduit, ever.
Well, is the technologies he talks about are technologies. They're nostalgic.
Yeah, I mean, but that's, I mean, I guess there's some question then, and this is a conversation that you and I have had, is like, well, what is the role of nostalgia in Heideggerian thought? I mean, that's a huge question. I don't mean it's that.
Okay, here's what I think it is, and I'm going to come back to the Gelassenheit essay. It's coming to the right relation to technology, and I think he's got a point. So, for instance, you know, you go out west, and because you've got massive agribusiness, we're draining the aquifers, and there's consequences for that, right? So there's a certain way of life that's being pursued without regard for bringing into the conversation other aspects of how we dwell, including the very land in which we dwell. We're taking time to figure out how that contributes to who and how we are. And Heidegger would point out that that's a bit of an abomination. It certainly has no sense of a future, because who's going to live there 50 years from now, 100 years from now when there's no water? What's that going to be like?
Not humans.
Well, okay, but I think a way to understand what he's trying to get at, and I think of the fourfold this way too, is that while the opportunities to do whatever are manifold, there's going to be consequences for, or a faithfulness to the choices you make. And part of responding to the world is attending to how those consequences in turn emerge, how they disclose themselves, and the appeals they make to us. And that ultimately is why I find Heidegger rhetorical. Because at the end of the Thing essay, he keeps talking about the appeals. They're appeals. Now, Aristotle talks about his three appeals. Why don't we add Heidegger's appeal there as a fourth one? Or a fifth one after Burke's identification. So, there's something about the world and its worlding that makes appeals to us. It's like there's certain grooves that emerge, patterns, habituations. Some are better than others. It would be foolish to deny that. And I think Heidegger is trying to say the world in its worlding makes appeals on us, asks us to respond. Of course, we're free to ignore. He thinks we ignore too much. That may or may not be the case. But in terms of the ontology he sets up, I find what he says useful and insightful.
Well, and I also, one of the things that appeals to me about Heidegger, and I talked about this briefly before we hooked in with you, is that, if you have to pick between subject and object, right, I'd pick object too, right? I mean, in this sort of Heideggerian insistence contra a great deal of the philosophical tradition, both before and after Heidegger, where objects participate, right? Or rather, things. I mean, I'm not making the object thing distinction that he does here, but that objects participate in active and constitutive ways to forging ecology, network, etc. And that strikes me as an extremely important point. I just wonder how much this really does still just center around. Yeah, we don't talk about Dasein after 1932 or whatever, but aren't we still talking about Dasein in the question of the thing too? I mean, don't we retain the centrality of the human, or here's another way of asking it. Is the fourfold really a fourfold, or does it seem like it's leaning heavily on one of those axes?
I think it's fourfold.
Okay. Okay, yeah, hey.
Well, let's think about the jug for a minute. The jug is a thing.
Oh, the fucking jug.
Or the
wine glass. Right.
Beer glass.
Right.
Beer glass is a thing. It's a thing on many levels. The outpouring of the gift, right? Yes.
But that's not going to count for him, because that's a beer.
So?
That's going to be a derivative, right? I mean, this is what he said, for instance, first and foremost, the one that is most sort of authentically true to the outpouring is a libation. It is a religious ceremonial beer, and it's only through what he describes as a withering and denaturing that it becomes merely an outpouring, and then at the lowest possible way, you get alcohol at a bar. That's
obviously, he'd never had scotch.
That's what I'm trying to get to.
John, he's a Black Forest hick, right? With a big brain. So, his tastes are a little provincial. I'm surprised he even talks about wine. That must have been high class for him. So, yeah. But, you could say the same thing about a scotch. I mean, again, I think it's not so much this is, I think, is a huge point. It's not so much the thing in itself. It's never the thing alone. Although he wants to isolate what makes a thing distinctive, ultimately that distinctiveness itself emerges as wedded and interconnected, deeply threaded to the world, both in the sense that that's where it came from and in the sense that that's how it gives back and participates. That's the twofold he starts working at first, right? He talks about how the making of the jug isn't really the essence of jugness, right? What's the essence of jugness? Vesseling, and vesseling is already knit into the world in a bajillion different ways. A lake is a vessel, a river's a vessel, your mouth is a vessel, your stomach's a vessel. Vesseling's already knit into the world as a possibility and a necessity that's entwined in every aspect of life. And in that sense, the jug is just a manifestation of something already ongoing in the world, and hence is a disclosure that helps disclose that and perhaps gives us some sense of the miracle of coming to presence in something that's absolutely mundane. And in that sense, this is something else I really like about Heidegger. He takes the most ordinary stuff and gives it a veneer of something special. And in that sense, in regards to your question to me on email, John, is Heidegger a religious thinker? In some ways, yes. But religion isn't singled out as this special thing that we can just talk about. Religion is already a part of the world's worlding. And it remains for us to disclose it in the manifold ways that we do.
And I agree with you. If I'm able to shift, and I recognize that Heidegger is doing this, and we all know it's a question of, a large part is a question of which idioms induce our generosity, right? And which induce our recalcitrance in some ways. And for me, you know, I have to work with the Heideggerian idiom because of the authenticity and the nostalgia predominantly. Because of those things, I have to work to give the reading, which is the reading that you just gave, which is that the jug itself, the jug on its own terms, is precisely external to itself. It is precisely not an essential interior property, or rather that essential interior property is its dispersion through, you know, the fourfold, through the particular social practices, through the earth, through the, right? And so,
it's
and I think
of world.
That's right, and I think that you're right, and I think that that's where, and there's, I don't know the reason for this, and this is something that I struggle with all the time, and why I'm interested in writing this style book, right, is that this to me is a claim that's no different from the kind of claim that Derrida will make about things, that Foucault will make about things, and yet for some reason, the idioms in which they're trafficking, you know, which I think have a lot less of a commitment to authenticity and nostalgia, it allows me, or it induces in me, or seduces me to give them the benefit of the doubt. Because what you just gave me in terms of the reading effect, you're right? And that is a much more interesting reading than, I mean, even look at the way that I phrased the question to you, right?
Yeah, I noticed.
No, but I mean, it's petty of me, right? Because I'm like, okay, despite the fact that the whole point of this analysis of the fourfold should be about the externality of things, it's precisely located in the thing itself. When if you just invert that, which is what you just did, that's a totally interesting point. Does any of that make any sense to anybody?
No. they're shaking their heads.
But
hey, have you read this essay by this guy? His name's eluding me at the moment, but he wrote this essay on Foucault and productive reading. Did you write that essay?
Let me just tell you right now, this is video. That's awesome.
Come on, that was gold, baby.
That was good. You did just use me against me.
Yeah.
Well played, sir. I want to go to the first question that I sent you, because I think that for me at least, this is the really big lesson that one gets from Heidegger. One also gets it. You can get it from Hegel, although the logic is different. And certainly, I mean, you can get it from Plato, right? But it's foregrounded really explicitly here. Is that what Heidegger is attempting to do is point to a thinking that moves beyond the proposition, right? And we went over, particularly in the introduction to Being in Time, and that's why I like to teach that introduction, is because, you know, from the very get-go, he's like, look, if you're thinking in terms of definitions in the conventional sense, this is not going to work for you, because, you know, or if you're thinking in terms of tautology and logical relations, that this is a thinking for whom that is, those rules, while useful in certain arenas, aren't going to be adequate to the types of questions that we're, the fundamental questions that we're trying to pose. So, and that, I mean, to me as a project, I mean, I tend to locate that, I guess, I locate that in Heidegger as the sort of point of deviation of continental and analytic philosophy, where logic becomes an epiphenomena of an underlying ontology as opposed to being the underlying problematic.
I think this starts wading into some pretty complex stuff.
Good.
I'll touch on it a little bit, and we can take it from there. In some ways, yes, he is trying to move beyond propositional logic. But there's another sense in which there's something he still likes about it that he gets out of Aristotle. And that is, a statement ought to be understood in its own terms.
God, see, I just hate that terminology. I have an allergic reaction to its own terms.
Okay, here's what that means, though.
Yeah.
It means that you don't just want to import another frame of reference to interpret it.
Which is
you want to let whatever it is you're talking about or whatever it is you're examining, you want to let that into the conversation in some way without simply imposing something else on it, whether that be you or some other external frame of reference that you're just forcing onto it.
See, I get, okay.
Phenomenology, right?
But this is where I start. But like, okay, to me, that's a starting point, and I take that starting point and I see the kind of ethical implications of that. But let's take another starting point, which is the one that I prefer to take, that I'm way more comfortable with. Every encounter is an appropriation, period. They're no less appropriate. No encounter is less appropriative than another encounter. But that doesn't mean there aren't different styles of appropriating. Again, it's never going to be a quantitative question of more or less appropriative, but different styles of appropriation. So rather than sort of indicating that there are like sort of more attuned responses or more, or like, rather than thinking those in quantitative terms, that's my turn to style, right? Is that I want to say it's not a question of the quantity of authenticity, attunement, whatever. It is a question of styles of, that's the difference between these idioms are stylistic differences. In a strong sense.
I tend to agree in most respects with what you're saying, but I also point out that I think later Heidegger actually makes a similar move and moves towards the language of appropriation and uses that word explicitly, although he means something by that. And by appropriation, he means sort of like what you're talking about, but in that same richly interconnected, ontologically interconnected sense. Right. So we're always already appropriated.
Well, he is
always going on.
In an interesting way, like the fourfold are relations of appropriation, but they're appropriation that function through expropriation, right? That's so, you know, and that to me is more interesting. But see, that's where to me, if you start with the terminology of thing itself, I see why you do that. You want to say there's something about the object that is not simply an imposition of a lens. I understand you don't. It's not just a subject. I mean, think for instance, like you're in an English department, right? Like that is the most common English department literary critical move that anyone ever makes, which is that every other person reading the Prelude has imposed their lens upon this poem. I, however, am going to remove all lenses and allow the poem to speak for itself. In other words, it is, to me, it is the paradigmatic kind of totalizing move to say that you're going to allow the thing to speak for itself. Instead of saying like, look, there are different kinds of appropriation. Every one of these people who's read is appropriating. I'm freaking appropriating. Like, or whether you call it appropriating or you call it imposing a lens or whatever else, and to say, now let's talk about the consequences of different styles of lensing. Lensing, I could do that if I was Heideggerian. I could say the lenses. Do you see what I'm saying? Because it feels to me like it costs a lot in terms of an implicit sense of authenticity and originality to use the language of the thing itself or the jug on its own terms.
Yeah. I think part of a problem here is our understanding of what an essence is.
Mhm.
For Heidegger, essence isn't a core. It's not a singular thing. It's not a definition. So if you want to go to, what example did you say, Prufrock? Was that your example?
The prelude, the quaalude, that's what we call it, right?
Oh, the prelude? Well, whatever it is. I don't know, fucking Shelley.
Yes, no.
Heidegger just wouldn't have this conversation in this way. He would say essence is a way of going through time with people in the world, and that letting the poem speak on its own terms isn't a matter of it's just going to speak for itself. He's talking about a certain way of engaging the poem that lets the poem into what the conversation is going to be as it goes forward in time. So there's a very dynamic and engaged aspect to what he's talking about here. And I think it's really easy for that to get lost. And on top of that, I think oftentimes he loses it.
Yeah.
And Heideggerians in particular can just drive me nuts with this stuff. You know,
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. So, to your understanding, for instance, the later concept of worlding is going to be incredibly important.
The later what?
Concept of worlding.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we're appropriated too. And in some ways, I think he thinks that human beings can be at their best when they tap into that. And, you know, before you start saying, well, that just sounds really moralistic, we can come back to that. There's styles of being or ways of being that are better than others.
Yeah.
And how would you judge them? Well, sometimes the world takes part in how that judging takes place. I'll give you an example that I've been thinking about lately a lot in terms of Heidegger, because I think there's an interesting comparison that can be made, and that's Deleuze and Guattari's notion of a black hole. You know, like drugs. Drugs can enable a musician a little bit, but ultimately they're a black hole. Why? Because at some point they start taking more than they give, right? So we could say that for Heidegger, technology can easily become a black hole. That might be a nice way of putting it. And that therefore it's not that you say no to technology, it's that you come to a different relationship to it so it doesn't become a black hole. That might be a way of putting it that maybe resonates with you better. I don't know.
Well, think about, I mean, for me, if I push the logic of the black hole, is that the black hole, the problem for them with the black hole is that it leads to death. You know, that's the terminal point. So if the black hole led to
creative death.
What's that?
Well, creative death.
Well, but the problem with what if the black hole were a seduction to, in their terminology, of becoming, even if it's a becoming non-human, in fact, it would only be a becoming non-human, then it would be something that is compelling. I mean, I think that the danger of the black hole element there is precisely that there's no more becoming. What you get is like a straight trajectory to annihilation, and not to, you know, becoming invisible or imperceptible. That it's a corruption in a sense.
Lane Staley.
Yeah, so I mean, and I take that point. I mean, that's where, and I do see that as the Heideggerian trajectory of the Heideggerian investment, and yet, again, to me, if you start with the thing itself or the object, that's certainly a starting point I would prefer to take rather than the subject. You know, certainly. At the same time, it just does seem to me that it costs. I mean, I hate to, you know, the economic terms, but that it in other words, part of what I'm saying is I find that Heideggerian nostalgia isn't just that he happens to like, you know, rural stuff, right? That it's sort of built in to this notion of there is a thing on its own terms, there is a jug on its own terms. That the nostalgia is really, I would say, it's an ontological nostalgia, you know. And I think that here's another way of saying it is, well, look, isn't the history of philosophy, the history of the forgetting and covering up of the question of being? Like, why is it not the history of the alternative differential disclosure of the question?
Well, he likes the question, man.
Okay, right? Like, but precisely because he likes the question, in his sort of asking, the sort of seeking and thinking, like all of that questioning thing, well, why the hell has everybody else's questioning sort of been inadequate? Well, it's been inadequate because you posit this notion of a primordial or originary relation that nobody else got to. It reads to me like Habermas in a sense, and not content-wise at all, but in the sense that, like, if you read Habermas's philosophical discourses on modernity, the thing that's astonishing to me when I read this is, you know, he's got chapters on Foucault, chapter on Nietzsche, chapter on Derrida, and each of those questions, the essay is basically organized around this question. What is it in Foucault's thinking that prevents him from coming to communicative rationality as the answer? What is it in Derrida's thinking that prevents him from coming to communicative rationality as the answer? Which is to say, he presumes his answer should have been everybody's answer, and he presumes his answer, the communicative rationality, should be the telos, not instrumental reason, and he reads all of these other thinkers as being, frankly, just kind of inadequate versions of him, and his question is why. And I think that's, I mean, it really, you know, it's amazing to me because it's also brilliant. It's not dumb at all, and I don't mean to be claiming that, but it's really, when I think in terms of moods and style, I think like, wow, this is just sort of a relentless failure to, a relentless commitment to the idea that I actually have the answer and that everybody else was just sort of not quite doing it right. And I see that in Heidegger. Tell me I'm wrong, please, tell me I'm wrong.
I would protest that there's a humility to Heidegger that you're ignoring, perhaps performatively.
Yes, I agree, and precisely. I mean, I think that you're on a good point there in terms of me recognizing the idiomatic quality that I'm reacting to, is because it's that very humility that produces the piety of Heideggerians, right? I mean, it's the sort of Jesus.
And it's insufferable because it's not really humble, whereas Heidegger actually tried to be humble, and he said so in a lot of ways, including elevating poets to the rank of thinkers of the first rank, in the same way that, say, Nietzsche elevated musicians to thinkers of the first rank, both moves of which I think are pretty brilliant. But even in the end of the thing, Heidegger talks about, you know what? Mistakes will happen. That's part of it. He talks about erring at the end. He knows he's making mistakes, and he cops to it in a way that very few thinkers actually do.
In fact, that was of everything that we read, that last sentence was my favorite. Because, I mean, there are sentences like that in Nietzsche that I quite like, where he talks about, you know, replacing one error with another.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And you get that sort of here, which is that, we'll find that last sentence there of, you know, following such paths takes practice in going, and practice needs craft. Stay on the path in genuine need and learn the craft of thinking, unswerving yet erring.
Yes.
Right? Like the relentless commitment to erring. Right?
And a certain poverty, because who cares about a thinker?
Right. I mean, stay on the path. Don't swerve. Err. Right. I mean, that's an interesting. Be wrong. Right. Don't, you know. I mean.
Yeah, but go be wrong magnificently.
Right. Yeah. That's right. And I agree with you in that sense of humility. And frankly, I mean, one of the things that I like, especially about being in time, and I think a little bit less so in the later stuff, is the carefulness of the exposition. You know, I mean, it's very. I was saying to these guys before, it's like being in time always reads to me like a slow movie, like a movie like the movie Her, right? Where like, not a lot of stuff actually happens in the movie. In fact, this sort of the lighting, the music, the set, like all those things are constituent. And for you and for ambience, right? This seems like Heidegger is in some ways a very ambient thinker. He's slow and sort of effusive, I guess. I don't know.
I think it's true of the later stuff. I think he's just as rigorous. He's. I mean, if you think about it, the Thing essay, it's like clockwork.
Yeah.
Gears just turn each time. The thinking is rigorous, but he abandons the language.
Yeah.
I think he's lost his faith in conceptual rigor. I think that's something else that I really like about the Fourfold. It's very concrete and engaged with the world, and he uses simple terms rather than philosophical terms, and they're terms that resonate deeply. And in that sense, the terms themselves, I think, are not concepts in the traditional sense. They're well springs. They're something to dig into, to think about. And yet they're also the very things that help us and enable us to think, will us or not us, because they're grooves of the world, if you will, ontological grooves, perhaps. And I really like that. A lot of Heideggerians try to say that the Fourfold is really Aristotle's four causes. Now, Aristotle's four causes are part of how the Fourfold thinks, but he goes beyond the four causes in a lot of ways. And then there's others who, like Graham Harman,
in terms of the relationship among the four, like that strikes me, you know, the sort of the necessary appropriative relationality between the four and however one thinks that, but that's not Aristotle, right? That's not, I mean, I don't even know how you could think that would be Aristotle.
Right, right. Although there's something about the final cause that Heidegger's obviously reworking.
Yeah.
But anyway, then Graham Harman says it's like concealment and non-concealment and tool and broken tool. That's the four axes of the Fourfold, which to me just seems dumb. I mean,
we'll edit that out, man. You don't want to get Graham pissed, did you?
Graham Harman's got some good stuff, don't get me wrong, but when you make it that reductive and just say, well, this is really what it means, it's an absolute refusal to think through some choices a thinker made that are careful and reflective.
Yeah.
Just to jump in, John.
Yeah, and by the way, I want to turn around now and say, like, let's give you guys a chance to, they might ask you about your chapter or
Sure.
whatever.
I was going to say, can we talk about the thinking and how it gathers a little bit more? Because I think that's what people typically get.
How the thing gathers?
Yeah. Like, so when he's talking about the jug, like, how does he bring in each of the four elements of the Fourfold to make it that work?
I think that's one of the reasons he uses the example of wine. Wine's easy, right? It might be harder to do with Elmer's glue.
Oh, that's totally connective. What are you talking about? It literally brings shit together.
Yeah. Or I was actually brainstorming another example. How about a football? Man, a football totally gathers the Fourfold. How so? Well, it comes of the earth. You know, it speaks to the cow and to the raising of the cow. It speaks to sun and earth. You know, his idioms for expressing various kinds of force, density, and light, or rock, and hidden and shown. I mean, the metaphors really work as well springs. You can keep digging into them. Then after a while, they'll turn into each other. So the football is earthly in that sense. And then you watch a football game, and people are playing with the football. And who could deny the excitement and the thrill of coming together in such a celebration of life and sport and competition and the attempt to achieve excellence? I mean, the football totally gathers the Fourfold. Why do you think people love it so much? And it has its heroes and its villains and its life in all its rich tapestry.
You're a romantic.
It can also be terrible. Heidegger, I don't think, ever ignores pain or suffering or death. He's just saying that's part of life too. You know, there's that other essay that I really like called Building Dwelling Thinking, where he talks about Black Forest farmhouse. And he talks about all the stuff in the house. And one of the things in the house is a coffin. You know, death also is part of our journey through life. You know, that can't be ignored. So,
other thoughts, questions, hopes, dreams, aspirations, deepest fears?
I'll try to sound smart here.
Don't sound smart.
At the beginning, a bit ago, we talked about the religious thinker part, and I think you said religion is already part of the world kind of thing.
Yeah.
If I'm a little confused on where you're going with that. I mean, I kind of get it, but maybe I'm just having a gap with my. Can you maybe clarify a little more on that? Like, could you give another example in relation with that? That would make sense.
I don't know. How about this? The sacred is always an available disclosure for how people commune together and build communities. It's always already there.
But not a privileged site of disclosure.
What's that?
But not a privileged site of disclosure. Or is it for Heidegger? Is it a privilege? Is the sacred a privileged site of disclosure?
I think insofar as he talks about the divine, which is always withdrawn, I'm thinking I see him saying is it's one of the major grooves.
Yes.
But you know what is the divine though? See, it's withdrawn. So it's not like it's just present for us. It takes disclosive work to yield it, and it takes manifold form. As manifold as human beings have been walking on the earth. It may be manifold for some of the higher primates even.
What's interesting about that way of thinking of it is that this really leads into Levinas in a sense. And I mean, coincidentally, we're doing Levinas and Derrida next week, but that kind of response is like, Levinas, of course, Levinas articulates himself in many ways, although deeply indebted to Heidegger, right? Clearly deeply, but as a kind of rejection of this emphasis on ontology as for his philosophy. He articulates himself as not doing that Heidegger thing that in fact, I think, but the way that you're talking about it there is, and I don't think that Levinas would just simply disagree with this, but it's a kind of continuation of the movement, like insofar as the divine or the sacred is the sort of locus of the coming to presence and never fully being present. It is a bit of a privileged hinge to a certain extent in the fourfold there.
I think any sense of transcendence or beyond or higher purpose or divinity or even, frankly, even cultural heroes function in this role. You know, it's I think an irrepressible aspect of
Brett Favre for you.
Yeah, Brett Favre. Although right now it's Tom Brady. Look at that man go.
Yes, right. He is.
I love that the dedication to excellence and craft. You got to respect that. It's heroic in a sense. He doesn't have to do it.
But he actually is a god, though, so it's not really fair.
Oh, so you agree with me on this?
Totally 100%. There's no question. Other thoughts, questions? Well, Thomas, thanks for joining us, bud. This was much fun. I totally enjoyed it. And we now have a recording of this up on YouTube, so I'll send you a link to give you access to it if for some strange reason you would ever want to watch yourself. We'll see where these things are going to go. Well, I figured, I'm doing this, so I might as well have an archive of it to see if something can come of it, whether it's like edited clips or whatever. We'll see. But thanks for taking the time, man. And it's always fun to chat. And I'm going to tell these guys to email you questions about the ambient book if they have any.
I hope I was lucid.
You were much better than 2 nights ago. 2 nights ago, I was like pulling teeth to get you to say a freaking word. I was like, this is going to be painful to sit in front of this class.
I was dead.
I'm just playing, man. Tell Jenny and the kids I said hey, and I'll chat with you soon, bud.
All right then.
All right, take care.
Thanks for listening. Y'all were great.
Thank
Feel free to ask me questions anytime. Bye, John.
See you, bud.